The moment arrives in the quiet hours when the noise of the day fades and the mind turns inward. You picture the years stretching ahead, each one resembling the last, and a subtle dread surfaces, not from any single catastrophe, but from the accumulating weight of paths left unexplored. It is the realization that the decisions made in the name of security may have quietly closed off the very experiences that would have given life its texture and meaning. That awareness does not arrive with drama. It arrives as a slow tightening in the chest, a question that lingers after the lights are out. What portion of your one existence has already been surrendered to the comfort of not risking enough? Welcome to this audiobook experience. Find a space where you can remain undisturbed, settle into your chair or lie back if that feels right, and allow these words to move through you without the usual rush of daily demands. What unfolds here is an examination of the forces that shape the choices we rarely question, the ones that determine whether a life expands or gradually contracts. The central inquiry is straightforward yet rarely confronted with full honesty. What is the true cost of consistently choosing safety over the unknown possibilities that sit just outside our familiar routines? In the exploration that follows, you will come to see how the pursuit of comfort operates as an invisible architecture, one that begins as protection and slowly rearranges itself into confinement. You will witness how the brain's preference for certainty gradually dulls ambition, creativity, and the capacity for genuine transformation, often without any dramatic warning signs. Understanding this process matters because it explains the quiet disappointment so many capable people carry, the sense that their days are filled yet somehow empty of the vitality they once expected. By staying with these ideas, you may begin to recognize patterns in your own life that have operated beneath awareness, patterns that can still be altered once they are seen clearly. Consider the way comfort first presents itself. It offers relief from the friction of uncertainty, the steady paycheck that removes immediate financial worry, the familiar circle of relationships that require no new effort to maintain, the routines that allow the mind to operate on autopilot. At the outset, these arrangements feel like wisdom. They reduce stress in the short term and create a predictable rhythm that the nervous system rewards with a sense of calm. Yet over months and then years, the same arrangements begin to extract a different price. The absence of friction also removes the pressure that once forced new skills to develop. The predictable rhythm gradually replaces the curiosity that once prompted questions about what else might be possible. What remains is a life that functions efficiently, but no longer expands. Ethan discovered this pattern only after it had already reshaped him. In his late 20s, he held a respected position in a large consulting firm, the kind of role that brought steady advancement, and the respect of colleagues who valued his reliability. He had always carried a private ambition to write fiction, stories that explored the inner lives of people navigating moral ambiguity. Several times he had sketched outlines during weekends and even completed a few chapters that surprised him with their depth. When a senior partner offered him the chance to reduce his hours temporarily so he could test whether writing could become more than a hobby, Ethan felt the familiar tightening of hesitation. The reduced income would mean postponing the down payment on a house his partner wanted. The time away from the firm might signal to others that he lacked seriousness about his career. He chose instead to keep the full schedule, telling himself the writing could wait until the financial foundation felt more secure. 5 years later, the notebooks remained in a drawer, the outlines yellowed at the edges. When he tried to return to them, the sentences no longer flowed with the same ease. The part of his mind that had once generated characters and tension had grown quiet from lack of use. He still performed his work competently, yet he carried a private sense that something essential within him had been allowed to dim, without any single dramatic event to mark its passing. The same gradual narrowing appears in different forms across many lives. Sophia had trained as a graphic designer with a distinctive eye for visual storytelling, the clients repeatedly praised. She accepted a secure position at a mid-sized agency where her days consisted of executing other people's briefs rather than developing her own visual language. The salary covered her rent and allowed modest savings. The colleagues were kind. When an opportunity arose to join a smaller studio that focused on independent film projects, the move would have required learning new software, accepting irregular income for a period, and relocating to a city where she knew almost no one. She calculated the risks carefully and concluded that the stability of her current role outweighed the uncertain upside. Over the next decade, she became highly efficient at the work she performed, yet she noticed that the excitement she once felt when opening a new design brief had been replaced by a mechanical competence. The distinctive style she had once been recognized for gradually softened into something safe and repeatable. Clients continued to approve her work, but she no longer recognized the spark that had originally drawn her to the field. The comfort of reliable employment had preserved her financial situation while quietly eroding the creative identity she had once considered central to who she was. These stories share a common mechanism. The human nervous system is wired to treat uncertainty as a form of threat, releasing stress hormones that create an immediate urge to return to known territory. When that urge is repeatedly followed, the brain strengthens neural pathways associated with avoidance, while the pathways associated with exploration and novelty receive less reinforcement. Over time, the range of what feels tolerable narrows without any conscious decision to limit it. What began as a reasonable preference for security becomes an automatic response that no longer serves the person's deeper aims. The individual may still describe their life as good or even successful by external measures. Yet an internal register registers the absence of vitality that once accompanied the pursuit of something just beyond reach. You may recognize moments in your own history when a similar calculation occurred. An invitation arrived that carried both possibility and discomfort. The mind quickly supplied reasons why the timing was not ideal, why preparation was insufficient, why the potential downside outweighed the possible gain. Those reasons often contained elements of truth. Yet beneath the stated logic ran another current, one that asked whether the self that would emerge on the other side of the risk could still be managed and protected. The choice to remain in place felt like prudence. Only later did it become clear that the protection had also preserved a version of life that was smaller than the one that might have been available. The process extends beyond careers into the quieter domains of relationships and personal growth. Oliver maintained a circle of friendships that had formed in his early 20s. The gatherings were predictable. The conversations remained within familiar territory, and the emotional labor required stayed minimal. When new people entered his extended social world who carried different perspectives and interests, he felt a brief curiosity followed by the thought that deepening those connections would require time and vulnerability he did not currently possess. He continued to invest in the existing group, whose members offered reliable companionship without demanding much adaptation from him. Years later, he noticed that the conversations at gatherings had grown increasingly repetitive, that the sense of being truly seen had diminished, and that he had few relationships in which he could discuss the questions that now occupied his private thoughts. The comfort of familiar company had protected him from the awkwardness of beginning again. Yet it had also left him with a form of loneliness that felt harder to name because nothing overtly painful had occurred. The same pattern appears when individuals remain in environments that no longer challenge their capacities. Amelia held a role in organizational development where she had become the person others turned to for smoothing conflicts and maintaining harmony. She performed the function well and received consistent recognition. When a larger organization offered her a position that would require building systems from the ground up and managing teams through periods of genuine uncertainty, she declined after calculating the additional stress and the possibility that she might not succeed immediately. She told herself that her current contributions were valuable and that there would be other opportunities later. The later opportunities arrived, yet each time the same calculation repeated itself. By her mid-40s, she had developed a reputation for being exceptionally steady under pressure. Yet she also carried an unexpressed sense that her professional identity had stopped evolving long before her career technically ended. The safety she had protected had preserved her from visible failure, while preventing the stretch that would have revealed capacities she had not yet tested. What these accounts reveal is that comfort does not announce its costs in advance. It operates through a series of small, reasonable decisions whose cumulative effect only becomes visible when measured against a longer timeline. The person who chooses the familiar path each time does not experience a sudden collapse. Instead, they experience a gradual replacement of one kind of life with another. The replacement often carries external markers of success, stability, and respect. Internally, however, a different register keeps track of the vitality that has been set aside. That internal register does not always speak in clear sentences. It surfaces instead as a low-level restlessness, a tendency to imagine alternative versions of the present during quiet moments, or a subtle difficulty in feeling fully engaged with activities that once brought satisfaction. The psychological literature on decision-making under uncertainty helps explain why this replacement occurs so consistently. When outcomes cannot be predicted with confidence, the mind tends to overweight the potential for loss relative to the potential for gain, even when objective probabilities suggest the upside is substantial. This tendency is not a flaw in reasoning, but an adaptive response shaped by environments in which survival once depended on avoiding rare but catastrophic events. In contemporary life, the same mechanism continues to operate, now applied to social, creative, and professional risks whose downsides are rarely life-threatening, yet still register in the nervous system as threats to be minimized. The result is a systematic bias toward preserving the current state even when that state no longer aligns with the person's evolving values or capacities. You may find yourself wondering, as these patterns become clearer, whether the comfort you currently protect is serving the life you actually want to inhabit 5 or 10 years from now. That question does not demand an immediate dramatic change. It asks instead for a more precise form of attention, one that notices when the avoidance of discomfort has begun to limit the range of experiences still available. The noticing itself begins to loosen the grip of the invisible architecture. Once the pattern is visible, the possibility of choosing differently, even in small increments, becomes real rather than theoretical. As the examination of comfort's hidden costs deepens, another layer of the price comes into view, one that involves not only what is gradually lost, but what is never allowed to begin. The discussion now turns to the particular form of suffering that arises from opportunities left unexplored, the persistent ache of actions not taken and words not spoken. Understanding this dimension of regret carries particular weight because it reframes the very nature of fear. While the pain of attempting something and falling short often carries lessons that can be integrated, the pain of never having attempted at all tends to remain unresolved, replaying across years without the clarifying information that action would have provided. This distinction matters because it suggests that the fears which most powerfully constrain life are frequently not the fears of failure itself, but the fears of rejection, judgment, and the uncertainty of outcomes that cannot be controlled in advance. Benjamin carried one such regret for more than a decade. During a professional conference, he had prepared a brief presentation on a process improvement that had produced measurable results in his department. Several times during the event, he found himself in conversation with a senior executive from another organization who expressed genuine interest in the approach. Each time the moment arrived when Benjamin could have asked whether the executive would be willing to hear a fuller description over coffee the following morning, he felt a rush of anticipatory discomfort. He imagined the possibility that his work might not withstand closer scrutiny, that he might appear presumptuous, or that the conversation might simply confirm that his contribution was smaller than he hoped. He chose instead to keep the exchange at the level of polite acknowledgement. Months later, he learned that the executive had implemented a similar process after hearing about it from another participant at the same conference. The knowledge that the idea had found its way forward without him did not produce dramatic self-reproach. Instead, it created a quiet, recurring awareness during subsequent professional gatherings that an opening had existed and that he had allowed it to close through hesitation rather than through any external barrier. The regret did not center on the lost recognition. It centered on the version of himself that had remained silent when speech had been possible. The same structure of missed possibility appears in more personal domains. Victoria had long felt drawn to environments where language and culture operated differently from the ones she had known since childhood. When a professional opportunity required relocating to a city whose rhythms and social codes were unfamiliar, she weighed the practical disruptions against the stability of remaining where her support network and professional reputation were already established. The decision to stay carried immediate relief. The years that followed brought continued professional advancement within the familiar setting. Yet during periods of transition or challenge, she would find herself imagining the parallel life in which she had accepted the relocation. The imagining was not accompanied by certainty that the alternative path would have been better. It was accompanied instead by the awareness that she had never tested her capacity to adapt to circumstances she could not fully anticipate. That untested capacity became a quiet absence, one that surfaced whenever she encountered people who had made comparable moves and described the expansion that had followed their initial discomfort. Regret of this kind draws its particular force from the fact that it cannot be resolved through later action in the same way that many failures can be addressed. A project that did not succeed can often be revised or replaced with another attempt. A relationship that ended can sometimes be repaired or succeeded by a different connection. An opportunity that was never pursued, however, exists only as a counterfactual whose actual outcome remains permanently unavailable. The mind can generate endless variations of what might have occurred, yet none of them can be tested against reality. This feature of untaken chances explains why they often exert a stronger influence on long-term well-being than the memory of attempts that did not work out. The latter carry information. The former carry only the persistent sense that a different version of one's life remains forever out of reach. Emily experienced this form of unresolved wondering in the context of a friendship that had carried unspoken depth for several years. She and her closest male friend shared a history of mutual support through major transitions, yet she had never expressed the romantic feelings that had developed alongside the friendship. Each time an opening appeared, a moment when the conversation turned toward the future, or when physical proximity carried a different charge, she felt the possibility of speaking and the simultaneous fear of altering the existing bond in ways she could not control. She chose instead to preserve the relationship in its current form, telling herself that the friendship itself was too valuable to risk. Years later, the friend entered a committed relationship with someone else. Emily offered her genuine support and continued to value the connection they maintained. At the same time, she noticed that certain conversations now carried an undercurrent of what had remained unspoken. The regret did not center on the loss of a romantic outcome. It centered on the fact that she had never allowed the friendship to encounter the truth of her feelings, thereby preventing both herself and her friend from responding to reality rather than to an incomplete version of it. The silence had protected the relationship from immediate disruption while also preventing it from becoming fully honest. These accounts point to a consistent pattern in how fear operates when the outcome cannot be known in advance. The fear of rejection anticipates the pain of hearing no or of being seen as insufficient. The fear of judgment anticipates the evaluations of others whose opinions may matter less than they appear to in the moment of decision. The fear of uncertainty anticipates the discomfort of operating without a clear map. Each of these fears contains an element of accurate prediction. Rejection, judgment, and uncertainty do occur and can be painful. Yet the anticipation of that pain often receives greater weight in the decision process than the longer-term consequences of allowing the fear to dictate the choice. The result is a systematic preference for the known discomfort of remaining in place over the unknown discomfort of moving forward. You may notice, as these patterns are examined, that the moments of hesitation in your own life often share the structure. An opening appears that would require tolerating a period of not knowing how events will unfold. The mind supplies vivid images of possible negative outcomes. Those images feel immediate and concrete. The potential gains remain more abstract because they depend on actions that have not yet been taken. In the space between the concrete fear and the abstract possibility, the choice to preserve the current state frequently prevails. Only later does the cost of that preservation become visible, and by then the original opening no longer exists in the same form. The recognition of these costs does not by itself remove the fears that generate them. It does, however, alter the terms of the internal conversation. When the long-term price of consistent avoidance is held in awareness, alongside the short-term discomfort of action, the calculation shifts. The question changes from whether risk can be eliminated to how risk can be engaged in ways that honor both the need for reasonable protection and the deeper requirement for a life that continues to expand. That shift in framing prepares the ground for examining the specific practices through which individuals learn to move forward even when certainty remains unavailable. With that altered internal conversation now available, the exploration turns toward the force that most consistently determines whether any given choice will lean toward preservation or expansion. What opens next is an examination of fear, not as an obstacle to be eliminated, but as the gateway through which every meaningful step must pass. Before we enter that territory, know that you are about to discover the precise ways in which the human brain has been shaped across evolutionary time to treat uncertainty as a signal of potential threat, even when the threat exists only in the realm of social perception or untested possibility. You will see how this ancient design continues to operate beneath conscious awareness, generating resistance that feels personal, yet originates in systems designed for an environment far different from the one we now inhabit. Understanding these patterns changes everything because it shifts the question from why we struggle to act despite knowing better to how we can work with the brain's protective architecture, rather than fighting against it as if it were a personal failing. The insights that follow will allow you to recognize the automatic responses that arise in your own body and mind when opportunity carries an element of the unknown. And in that recognition, a different relationship with fear becomes possible. The resistance begins in structures that formed long before language or conscious reasoning existed. In ancestral environments, a sudden movement in the periphery or an unfamiliar sound could indicate a predator, and the individuals whose nervous systems responded most rapidly with heightened alertness survived to pass on those traits. The amygdala and its connected circuits learned to treat novelty and uncertainty as potential dangers that warranted immediate physiological preparation for fight or flight. That preparation included increased heart rate, narrowed attention, and a bias toward whatever action would return the organism to a state of greater predictability. In contemporary life, the same circuits continue to activate when the uncertainty involves speaking in a meeting, proposing a new direction at work, or revealing a private aspiration to someone whose response cannot be guaranteed. The body registers the situation as though physical survival were at stake, even though the actual consequences involve social evaluation or temporary discomfort rather than mortal threat. Because the response arrives before conscious thought can evaluate the true level of danger, the individual often experiences the resistance as an inherent truth about the situation rather than as an inherited survival mechanism operating out of context. Charlotte encountered this mismatch during a period when her work as a high school teacher had begun to feel repetitive. She had developed a series of lessons that integrated student personal writing with historical texts in ways that produced visible increases in engagement and depth of thought. When an opportunity arose to present the approach at a regional education conference, she felt an immediate internal tightening. Her mind supplied a rapid sequence of concerns about whether the data she had gathered would hold up under scrutiny, whether other educators might view her methods as insufficiently rigorous, and whether the act of claiming expertise might expose her to forms of judgment she had managed to avoid by remaining within the familiar boundaries of her classroom. She noticed her shoulders rising and her breath becoming shallower as she considered the application form. Although she could articulate to herself that the worst plausible outcome involved receiving polite feedback and returning to her regular schedule, the physiological response continued to signal that something essential needed protection. She completed the application only after deliberately scheduling time to complete it, when her attention was already occupied with other tasks, thereby reducing the space in which the resistance could expand. The presentation itself proved less exposing than the anticipation had suggested, yet the memory of the bodily reluctance remained available as evidence of how powerfully the ancient circuitry could shape decisions even when the rational mind assessed the risk as modest. The same circuitry influences decisions at larger scales. Daniel had spent 15 years advancing within a manufacturing company, where his expertise in process optimization had become central to several production lines. When a competitor offered him a leadership role that would require relocating his family and rebuilding credibility within a new organizational culture, he experienced not only the expected practical calculations, but also a persistent somatic resistance that arrived each time he reviewed the offer. His chest would tighten during conversations about the move, and he found himself returning repeatedly to the question of whether the current role still contained unexplored challenges that could be pursued without disruption. The resistance did not present itself as a clear argument against the opportunity. Instead, it manifested as a diffuse sense that the known environment, despite its limitations, represented safety in a way the new role could not guarantee. Over several weeks, he observed that the intensity of the physical response diminished slightly when he allowed himself to imagine the worst-case scenario in concrete detail rather than leaving it as an undefined threat. The act of naming the specific losses that might occur, such as the temporary reduction in influence while relationships formed in the new setting, reduced the power of the undifferentiated alarm that the brain had been generating. He eventually accepted the position, yet the process of moving forward required repeated acknowledgement that the resistance was a normal output of survival-oriented circuitry rather than an accurate assessment of the opportunity's actual risk level. These experiences illustrate how emotional decision-making often overrides the slower, more deliberative processes housed in the prefrontal cortex. When uncertainty activates the limbic system, the brain prioritizes rapid categorization of the situation as safe or unsafe. Information that supports the unsafe categorization receives amplified attention, while information that might support a more nuanced evaluation receives less processing resources. The result is a form of tunnel vision in which the potential downsides appear more vivid and immediate than they would under conditions of lower physiological arousal. Uncertainty avoidance therefore operates not only as a cognitive preference, but as a full body state that makes certain choices feel intuitively correct, even when those choices limit longer-term development. The individual may later reflect that the decision did not align with stated values or aspirations, yet in the moment, the resistance feels like wisdom rather than an artifact of evolutionary history. Alexander experienced this narrowing during a period when his work as a freelance photographer had reached a plateau. He had developed a distinctive approach to environmental portraiture that combined technical precision with an unusual capacity to put subjects at ease. Several gallery owners had expressed interest in a solo exhibition, yet each time he began assembling a proposal, the familiar sequence of concerns would arise. He would imagine the possibility that the work would be perceived as derivative, that the technical execution would reveal weaknesses under gallery lighting, or that the act of presenting himself as an artist rather than a commercial photographer would close off the steady client work that currently sustained him. The concerns carried enough surface plausibility that he could treat them as rational analysis. Only when he began keeping a record of the thoughts that appeared during these moments did he notice how consistently they emphasized potential loss while giving little attention to the possibility that the exhibition might expand his client base or simply confirm that his current direction held value worth developing further. The record revealed a consistent bias in which the brain's protective mechanisms generated vivid simulations of negative outcomes while leaving positive or neutral outcomes comparatively vague. Once this pattern became visible, he could introduce a deliberate counter-practice of generating equally detailed simulations of what success or even modest positive reception might look and feel like. The resistance did not disappear, yet its automatic authority diminished enough for him to complete and submit the proposal. You may recognize in these accounts moments when your own body has signaled caution in situations where the actual stakes involved reputation, temporary discomfort, or the need to tolerate not knowing how events would unfold. The recognition does not require judging the resistance as wrong. It requires only noticing that the response originates in systems whose primary mandate remains the avoidance of catastrophic loss rather than the pursuit of expanded capacity or deeper fulfillment. When that distinction becomes clear, the possibility of working with the response rather than being governed by it increases. One can acknowledge the tightening in the chest or the rapid generation of reasons to wait while still choosing to gather additional information, to take a small experimental step, or to simply remain present with the discomfort long enough for the slower deliberative processes to contribute their perspective. The fear itself becomes data rather than directive. Having examined how the brain's ancient protective mechanisms generate resistance even when contemporary circumstances do not require the same level of caution, we can now turn to the quality that permits movement in the presence of that resistance. What you are about to discover is that courage has been widely mischaracterized as a special state in which fear has already been conquered or transcended. In reality, courage consists of the decision to act while fear or uncertainty remains active. This distinction matters because it removes the prerequisite that one must first achieve an internal condition of fearlessness before any forward movement becomes legitimate. Most people who accomplish meaningful things do not report the absence of fear. They report the presence of fear alongside a commitment to proceed anyway, often because the cost of remaining in place has become more vivid than the discomfort of moving forward. The exploration that follows will show how this form of courage develops through practice rather than through the elimination of uncertainty, and how the identity of the person who acts gradually expands to include capacities that were not available before the action occurred. Sophia had spent several years in a professional role that utilized her analytical strengths while leaving other dimensions of her interests unexplored. When an opportunity arose to lead a cross-functional initiative that would require facilitating difficult conversations among colleagues who held competing priorities, she felt the familiar internal resistance accompanied by a newer recognition that remaining in her current pattern would eventually produce a form of professional stagnation she had already begun to sense. She accepted the assignment while still carrying the bodily awareness that the facilitation would expose her to moments of visible uncertainty in front of people whose respect mattered to her. During the first several meetings, she noticed her tendency to prepare excessively detailed agendas as a way of reducing the space in which unforeseen dynamics might emerge. Over time, she began to experiment with leaving small portions of each meeting open for emergent concerns. The experiments sometimes produced awkward silences or unexpected disagreements, yet they also generated solutions that no amount of pre-planning could have produced. Each time she tolerated the discomfort of not knowing exactly how a conversation would resolve, her sense of herself as someone who could navigate ambiguity increased. The identity shift did not occur because the fear disappeared. It occurred because she continued to act while the fear remained present, and the accumulated experience of having survived multiple uncertain exchanges gradually rewrote the internal narrative of what she was capable of handling. The same process of identity expansion through action appears when individuals confront uncertainty in more personal domains. Oliver had maintained a long-standing pattern of keeping his deeper aspirations private, sharing them only with a small circle of trusted friends who could be counted on to respond with encouragement rather than challenge. When he decided to submit a manuscript he had been revising for several years to a literary agent whose list included writers whose work he admired, the decision required tolerating a period in which the outcome remained entirely outside his control. He experienced waves of anticipatory concern about whether the submission would be perceived as presumptuous or whether the work itself would be judged as insufficiently developed. Rather than waiting for those concerns to subside, he established a small daily practice of sending one additional query or making one revision while explicitly noting the presence of the concern without allowing it to halt the action. The agent eventually responded with interest and a request for revisions. The outcome mattered less than the internal shift that had occurred during the months of sending work into uncertainty. Oliver began to experience himself as someone who could tolerate not knowing how his efforts would be received, a capacity that extended beyond the specific project into other areas where he had previously defaulted to silence. These accounts suggest that resilience is not a fixed trait, but a capacity built through repeated exposure to situations in which the outcome cannot be guaranteed in advance. Each time an individual acts while carrying uncertainty, the nervous system receives new information that the feared consequences, when they occur at all, are often survivable and sometimes even generative. The brain updates its models of what constitutes threat, gradually expanding the range of situations that can be approached without triggering the full protective response. This updating does not occur through intellectual understanding alone. It requires the embodied experience of having moved forward while the protective mechanisms were still active. The person who emerges from such sequences is not someone who has become fearless. They are someone whose relationship with fear has changed because fear no longer functions as an absolute veto on action. You may find yourself wondering as these patterns become visible, what becomes possible when the presence of fear is treated as information rather than as a command to remain in place. The question does not require an immediate dramatic answer. It invites a more precise form of attention to the moments when an opening appears and the familiar tightening arrives alongside it. In those moments, The choice to take one small step while acknowledging the resistance begins to accumulate into a different kind of life, one in which the default is no longer preservation at all costs, but a willingness to discover what capacities become available only on the other side of uncertainty. Amelia had long carried an interest in developing a community education program that would bring together people from different professional backgrounds to explore questions of meaning and purpose that rarely surfaced in their daily work. She had discussed the idea with several friends, yet had never moved beyond conversation, because the logistics of organizing such a program involved multiple unknowns, including whether enough people would participate and whether she possessed the facilitation skills the format would require. When a local community center offered space for a pilot session, she accepted while still feeling the pull to delay until the plan felt more complete. She began by inviting a small group whose responses she could predict with reasonable confidence. The session revealed both the appeal of the format and several gaps in her preparation that became visible only in the actual interaction. Rather than interpreting the gaps as evidence that she should have waited longer, she treated them as data that could inform the next iteration. Subsequent sessions incorporated adjustments, and the program gradually developed a rhythm and a following that no amount of pre-planning could have fully anticipated. The growth of the initiative mattered, yet the deeper transformation occurred in Amelia's relationship with her own capacity to begin something whose full shape could not be known in advance. She had acted from the recognition that meaningful endeavors rarely arrive with guarantees, and the experience of building the program while carrying that recognition altered her sense of what she could initiate in other areas of her life. The pattern that emerges across these accounts is that personal transformation occurs less through the elimination of uncertainty than through the decision to proceed while uncertainty remains active. Confidence in this framing is not a precondition for action, but a frequent byproduct of having acted despite the absence of confidence. The individual who has navigated several uncertain situations develops a form of self-trust that differs from the assurance that comes from staying within well-mapped territory. This self-trust includes the knowledge that discomfort can be tolerated, that mistakes made in the open can be repaired or learned from, and that the identity one carries into the next chapter has been shaped by the willingness to step beyond what was already known to be safe. Benjamin had spent much of his adult life in roles that required him to translate complex technical information for non-technical audiences. He performed the function competently, yet had long felt a private pull toward work that would allow greater creative expression. When a former colleague invited him to contribute to a documentary project that would require learning new skills and appearing on camera in limited segments, he felt both the pull and the familiar resistance that accompanied any departure from established competence. He accepted a small initial role while carrying the awareness that his performance would be visible to people whose opinions he valued. The experience included moments of visible awkwardness during early recordings and the need to request multiple takes. Rather than interpreting those moments as confirmation that he should have remained in his previous lane, he treated them as evidence that he was operating at the edge of current capacity, the precise location where new capacities become available. Over the course of the project, his comfort with the new medium increased, and the documentary work eventually became a significant portion of his professional identity. The transformation did not occur because the initial uncertainty disappeared. It occurred because he continued to show up for the work while the uncertainty was still present, allowing the accumulated experience to rewrite his sense of what forms of expression were available to him. As these threads of recognition accumulate, a larger picture comes into view. The life that expands is not the one that succeeds in eliminating risk or in achieving perfect foresight before any step is taken. It is the life in which fear is acknowledged as a natural output of ancient protective systems and is nevertheless treated as one input among others rather than as the sole determinant of action. The person who cultivates this relationship with fear discovers that courage is less a dramatic quality possessed by exceptional individuals than an ordinary practice available in each moment when an opening appears and the choice is made to move forward while carrying whatever uncertainty that opening contains. The practice does not guarantee any particular outcome. It does guarantee that the range of possible lives continues to include versions that could not have been reached by remaining within the boundaries of what was already known to be safe. Thank you for spending this time with the audiobook and for allowing these ideas to unfold in your own reflection. If the perspectives shared here have illuminated something in your experience or offered language for patterns you had sensed but not yet named, consider subscribing to the channel so that future explorations can arrive when you are ready for them. A like on this video helps others who may be navigating similar questions find the conversation as well. Another life-changing book awaits in the next audiobook journey, one that will build directly on the territory we have begun to map and offer additional practices for engaging risk with greater clarity and intention. Until that time, carry the recognition that the power to shape a life of greater depth resides not in the elimination of uncertainty, but in the willingness to act while uncertainty remains present, allowing each step taken in the presence of fear to expand the territory of what becomes possible.